The objective for this lecture is to identify and analyze political, economic, and social characteristics of American slavery in the 19th century. This is a map of America during the 1800s, and this map shows the different types of crops that were grown in America during the 1800s. In the yellow, there's tobacco, and this symbol represents hemp. In the pink is sugarcane, in the blue is rice, and this big area in the green is cotton. Cotton was grown in the Old South. And when I say the Old South, what I'm referring to is this area of the country prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, this area of the country will be referred to as the New South. Cotton replaced sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor in the 19th century. The strength of American slavery rested on cotton. 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the southern United States. And cotton supplied textile mills in the North, Great Britain, and other European countries. And as early as 1803, cotton represented America's most important export. So cotton was very important not only to the South, but to the North during the 1800s in America. This is a picture of the triangle trade, and we discussed this earlier. The triangle trade was part of the mercantilist system, where slaves were purchased from Africa. They were sent to the American colonies. This was referred to as the first Middle Passage. And then the slaves produced crops such as tobacco. The tobacco was turned into manufactured goods, and those manufactured goods were sold to other parts of the world. And then Great Britain would take that money, purchase more slaves, and it would go in a triangle. The African slave trade was prohibited in 1808 in America. If you'll remember, in the Constitution, the Founding Fathers wrote that America would no longer participate in the African slave trade as of 1808. So, after 1808, America just participated in domestic slavery. So, in other words, they traded slaves or bought and sold slaves internally in America between different plantations in states. And the sale of slaves and trade of slaves within the U.S. really flourished at this time. This domestic slave trade was referred to as the Second Middle Passage. Part of the domestic slave trade included slave auctions. This is a photograph of a slave auction house. Slave auction houses were located in the main business districts of southern cities and contained the offices of slave traders. This auction house was located in the public market. So slave auctions worked very similarly to cattle auctions. I don't know if any of you have been to a cattle auction, but it was conducted in a similar manner. There would be an auctioneer. The auctioneer would call out prices, and slave traders would bid on slaves. What they would generally do was bring the slaves out, sometimes with clothing, sometimes with not, and they would parade them like they were selling a product, because that's what they were doing. So this is the selling of human beings, the selling of human cargo. Slaves are also sold in private homes as well. This is a document from an estate of a Southern slave trader. It's called the Sale of Slaves in Stock. So here you can get an understanding of the way slave auctions worked. What they would do is they would have the name of the slave, which they generally gave them. They would have what the slave could do, the skills they had, in other words, and then the price. For example, this slave was a rice planter and sold for $1,275. Generally, young men sold for the highest because young men were strong and they lived a long time. So it was a good investment. Sometimes they would sell children. Oftentimes, the children were for the plantation owners. Other children, and what I mean by that is they would buy a young slave child to be the playmate of a white plantation owner's child. Children generally sold for less because they couldn't participate in the work until they were a bit older. I'm going to show you a description of a slave auction. This is from a primary source. The source says, the slaves are put in stalls like the pens they use for cattle, a man and his wife with a child on each arm. And there's a curtain, sometimes just a sheet over the front of the stall, so the bidders can't see the stock. You'll notice the word stock too soon. Stock is what you refer to as animals. The overseers stand in just outside with a big black snake whip and a pepper box pistol in his belt. Across the square, a little piece, there's a big platform with steps leading to it. Then they pulls up the curtain and the bidders is crowding around. Them in back can't see, so he overseer drives the slaves out to the platform and he tells the ages of the slaves and what they do. They have white gloves there and one of the bidders takes a pair of gloves, I think they mean gloves here, and rubs his fingers over a man's teeth. And he says to the overseer, you can call this buck 20 years old. Again, reference to an animal. Why, there's cut worms in his teeth. He's 40 years old if he's a day, so they knock his buck down from $1,000. They calls the men bucks and the women wenches. When the slaves is on the platform, what they calls the block, the overseer yells, Tom or Jason, show the bidders how you walk. Then the slave steps across the platform and the bidding starts. At these slave auctions, the overseer yells, say you bucks and wenches, get in your hole, come out here. Then he makes them hop, he makes them trot, he makes them jump. How much he yells for his buck? $1,000, $1,100, $1,200. Then the bidders makes offers according to size and build. So that's a pretty explicit description of a slave auction. I'm also going to show you a clip from a movie called 12 Years a Slave. This is also very reflective of what we just read in that source.
Mr. Ford, splendid seeing you, sir. What catches your fancy? This lad? Ronnie, huh?
How much for one's flat in Eliza?
1,000 for flat. This is a nigger of considerable talent, I assure you. 700 for Eliza? My fairest price?
Accept the covenant.
Please,
Of course,
sir,
for you,
do
Mr.
not
Ford.
divide my family. Do not take me unless you take my choice.
Eliza, quiet!
You will have the most faithful slave, the most
Eliza.
faithful slave that's ever lived, but I beg that you
Your
do not
price for the
separate
best
us.
point.
Please.
Give you something to cry about. Randall, come forward. Come. Now, see how fit this is. Right fruit. Now, take your stick. Observe this. Jump, jump, jump. Run, run. Very good. You see this? It's very likely. You will grow into a fine beast. 600 for the boy. Family. Done.
Superb. Please.
Mr. Ford. Eliza.
How much of the you have no use for her. One so young will bring you no profit.
I cannot send
Please.
send piles of money to be made from her. She's a beauty even with the regular bloods. Thick-lipped, bullet-headed, cotton-picking niggers here.
Shut up. For God's sake, you're not sentimental.
Oh, my sentimentality extends the length of a coin. How do you take this love, Mr. Ford, or do you pass on?
I will take no one's pleasure in the lives of
So, Eliza and Fats,
Do not say
So as you can see from the film clip, slaves were put on display for sale. If you also notice from the clip that slave families were broken up. You see a female slave in this clip begging them to keep her family together. But most of the time, families were not kept together. That was not even a consideration. So it was emotionally draining for families. If you can imagine being the mother or father of a child and that child is taken from you forever, it's very emotionally abusive. And generally, slave children never saw their parents again, and the parents never saw their children again. I mentioned earlier that cotton was the major export in America during the 1800s. The North benefited from the sale of cotton, and the South benefited from the sale of cotton. So the North benefited from slavery, and the South benefited from slavery. Now, slavery will be abolished in the northern part of America primarily by the 1830s and the 1840s, but the North was still reliant on the slave trade for their economic system. You will start to see a division between the Northern economic system and the Southern economic system. The Northern economic system is going to be primarily manufacturing, due in part to the market revolution. But the Southern economy is going to remain agricultural, and they will maintain slavery as an institution. And this division of economies will fuel the debate over slavery, which ultimately leads to the Civil War. It's at least one of the factors that fuels the debate over slavery. This is an illustration of a southern plantation. The southern economic growth was different from the north. There were few large cities in the south. The north had a number of large cities such as New York City and Philadelphia, Boston, etc. The cities in the south were mainly centers for gathering and shipping cotton. New Orleans was the only city of significant size in the south. The south produced less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. So most of the crops and the goods from the south were going to the factories in the north or in Europe. It might surprise you to learn that 3/4 of white Southerners did not own slaves. Although the South was a predominantly slave economy, 3/4 of white Southerners did not own slaves. Most white Southerners lived on self-sufficient farms, but most whites were supported by slavery in one way or the other. A few people in the South spoke out against the planter elite, but most white Southerners supported the planter elite, meaning the plantation owners. Because if you think about it, the poor whites in the South had more in common with the slaves than they did with the plantation class or the planter class or the planter elite. Because poor whites were farm workers, and that's what their skill sets were. And so were slaves. The difference there is slaves are owned and bought and sold, and poor whites are not. And the poor whites, these self-sufficient farmers, didn't really benefit from slavery economically. But the plantation owners or the planter elites did. So why didn't these poor whites speak out against slavery? That was because they had a shared bond with these planter elites or the plantation class, in that they were both white and that they were superior to blacks, that they were superior to slaves. So in other words, it was racism. It was regional kinship ties. This is a slaveholding table from 1850. In this table, it shows the number of slaveholders who owned a certain number of slaves. For example, 68,000 slaveholders owned one slave. 105,000 slaveholders owned 2 to 4 slaves. 80,000 slaveholders owned 5 to 9 slaves. And if you look at the bottom of the table, you have 250 slaveholders owning 200 plus slaves. So what you have here is a small amount of slaveholders owning a large amount of slaves. And they generally were the dominant factor in the Southern economy. They had a great deal of power because they owned very, very large plantations. And just to give you a few statistics, in 1850, the majority of slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer slaves. Fewer than 2,000 families owned 100 slaves or more. So the ownership of slaves provided the route to wealth, status, and influence in the South, particularly those who owned 200 plus slaves. Slavery was a profit-making system. Men watched the world market for cotton and invested in infrastructure and managed their plantations. Their whole world was centered around profit-making based on slave labor. These plantations had particular gender roles. This is a depiction of a Southern plantation mistress. And there were defining roles on these plantations. For the plantation mistress, mistresses cared for 6 slaves. They oversaw the domestic servants and supervised the plantation when the master was away. The men on these plantations had different roles. They had more of the roles of managing the plantation or the business side of it. Planters discouraged their sons from entering what they refer to as the lowly trades, such as commerce and manufacturing. And that was primarily because the South had remained overwhelmingly agricultural. And Southern slave owners were hierarchical and paternal. That was ingrained in slave society. So, what I mean by that is this paternal thinking by slave owners allowed them to kind of justify being slave owners. It allowed the slave owners to think of themselves as kind and responsible masters because they viewed slaves as inferior. They viewed slaves as biologically inferior, not very smart, and almost akin to children that needed caring for, that in some way they were actually helping care for these slaves. Slavery was rationalized in the South. By the 1830s, not many Southerners believed that slavery was a necessary evil. The Founding Fathers believed that slavery was a necessary evil, that you needed slaves to be able to make money, to help build the economy, which helped build the Republic. And some Founding Fathers really grappled with the morality of slavery. But by the 1830s, slavery was pretty well solidified and justified in the South. Their argument included the following. First, Southerners were committed to white supremacy, meaning Southerners felt that whites were superior to blacks, to slaves. Second, Southerners believed that slavery was sanctioned in the Bible. Let me show you an example of a writing from the 1850s. It says here in part, Abraham, the chosen servant of God, had his bond servants, whose condition was similar to or worse than that of our slaves. He considered them as his property, to be bought and sold, as many other property which he owned. We find that both the Old and New Testaments speak of slavery, that they do not condemn the relation, but on the contrary, expressly allowed it or created it, and they give it commands and exhortations which are based upon its legality and propriety. It cannot then be wrong. So they're kind of arguing against that the idea of slavery it's immoral, right? That it was in the Bible. God sanctioned it. So, Abraham had slaves. So how can it be wrong? Third, they believed that slavery was essential to human progress. That in order for humans to progress in the Republic, slavery was necessary. Fourth, they believed that slavery guaranteed equality for whites, that whites couldn't have equality without slavery. After all, slavery did provide whites a means to make money, right? So that was kind of their justification. It's not a good justification, but it's what they believed. White Southerners declared themselves the true heirs of the American Revolution. So these pro-slavery arguments began to repudiate the ideas found in the Declaration of Independence that equality and freedom were universal entitlements. So because slavery goes against the Declaration of Independence, this idea of that all men are created equal. Because if you're a slave, you're clearly not created equal. But Southerners really began to say, well, that really doesn't include slaves, and that these Southerners we're really the true heirs of the American Revolution. The whites are really the true heirs of the American Revolution. The majority of white Southerners came to believe that freedom for whites rested on the power to command the labor of blacks, and that without slavery, freedom was not possible. So they kind of had make this whole liberty argument that we need slavery in order to have liberty in the republic. What they mean is liberty for white people. While the Southerners advocated for slavery and rationalized the need for slavery, many in the North opposed slavery. And there will be an abolitionist movement beginning in the early 1800s. Abolitionists wanted to get rid of slavery in America. And this is a picture of a leading abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass. Between 1800 and 1840, slavery was abolished in most of Spanish America and the British Empire. And abolition in the Americas influenced the debates over slavery in the United States. Advocates for slavery used post-emancipation decline in sugar and in other cash crops as evidence of British abolition's failure. So what they're saying is if you get rid of slavery, then you're going to have a decline in your major crops, and that's going to hurt the economy. But abolitionists argued that former slaves' rising living standards showed that emancipation had succeeded. And by mid-century, New World slavery remained only in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and then the United States. We will talk more about the abolitionist movement in a later lecture. Slave laws during the 1800s were very much the same as they were when they were first established in the Chesapeake colony. Slaves were considered property and had few legal rights. Slaves were not allowed to testify against a white person, carry a firearm. A slave could not be on a plantation without a white person present, although some of these laws were enforced differently depending on the plantation. In other words, some masters were more strict than others. Masters controlled whether slaves married and how they spent their free time. Let me give you an example of how much slaves were considered property. There was a trial of a female slave by the name of Celia. Celia was charged with murder and sentenced to die, but she was pregnant and her execution was delayed until she gave birth, so as to not deny the master's right to property. So the concern was not for the rights of Celia, the concern was for the rights of the master. So slaves were not viewed as human, they were viewed as property. A woman's unborn child was considered property and not human. As for the conditions of slave life, American slaves, as compared to their counterparts in the West Indies and in Brazil, enjoyed a better diet, low infant mortality rates, and longer life expectancies. And the reasons for this are the paternalistic idea of Southern slaveholders, meaning they felt they had to take care of their slaves in order to protect their investment. It wasn't that they felt this overwhelming desire of human caring, is that they needed to protect their investment. They did not want their slaves to get sick or get sick and die. because that would cut into their profits. Now, it doesn't mean that they fed them well or provided them, the best shelter. It just meant that they kept them alive and tried to prevent them from getting sick. But make no mistake, American slavery meant that you had no road to freedom if you were a slave. The only way you could become free was through the court's manumission process, meaning the master could go into court and set you free, or if a master decreed that you were free in their last will and testament. But both of those situations didn't happen very often. Slaves didn't earn their freedom very often. On the plantations, slaves performed a variety of tasks, but the majority of slaves worked in the fields. 75% of women and 90% of men worked as field hands. So there was no real gender barrier between men and women slaves. They did the same type of work in the fields. Other slaves worked as domestic slaves, meaning they were cooks, they were butlers, they were nannies, nursemaids. Some female slaves were wet nurses, meaning they nursed the plantation owners' children. Oftentimes, female slaves had children of their own, so which that allowed them to be able to have milk in order to nurse the plantation owners' children. Slaves worked in gangs on plantations under the direction of the overseers. So you can see this here. There are slaves working in the cotton fields. This is the overseer. Oftentimes the overseer would have a leather whip that they would use to keep the slaves in line. Sometimes the slaves would work chained together. That's referred to as chain gangs. Other slaves were in charge of particular tasks. That was generally the preferable type of slave labor, meaning you would given a particular task to do, such as build the barn or whatever it was, and you had a certain amount of time to do it. You worked on your own. You were never truly on your own, but you worked by yourself to perform a particular task. In the cities, slaves were servants, cooks, and other domestics, so both on the rural plantations and also in the cities, you would have domestic slaves. Some city slaves worked in iron works and tobacco factories. Some were skilled workers, such as artisans. And then occasionally you would have slaves live on their own. Now, in order to have the type of slave system that the Southerners did, it required maintaining order. And maintaining order rested on force, both physical force and psychological force. The physical force, I mean whippings, maimings, maiming of body parts is what I mean, or threatening to sell family members, threatening to sell children of slaves. If a slave had a girlfriend, they might threatened to sell that girlfriend. Uh, they would chain him up in graveyards. There were all kinds of psychological threats. One of the reasons that a number of slaves didn't run away was because there was always this threat that their family members would be harmed because they ran away from the plantation. So that's how they were able to maintain these large amounts of slave population, was through force, both physical and psychological force. I'm going to show you a few sources that really drive that point home. First is the punishments he received. And I will skip down here to the middle of the document. It says, I complained to my master of the treatment which I received from Major Freeland, but it made no difference. He cared nothing about it, so long as he received the money for my labor. After living with Major Freeland 5 or 6 months, I ran away and went into the woods back of the city, and when night came on, I made my way to my master's farm, knowing that if Mr. Haskell, the overseer, should discover me, I should be again carried back to Major Freeland, so I kept in the woods. One day while in the woods, I heard the barking and howling of dogs, and in short time they came so near that I knew them to be the bloodhounds of Major Benjamin O'Fallon. He kept 5 or 6 to hunt runaway slaves with. As soon as I was convinced that it was them, I knew that there was no chance of escape. I took refuge in the top of a tree, and the hounds were soon at its base, and then remained until the hunters came up in a half or 3/4 of an hour afterwards. There were 2 men with dogs, who, as soon as they came up, ordered me to descend. I came down, was tied, and taken to St. Louis jail. Major Freeland soon made his appearance and took me out and ordered me to follow him, which I did. After we returned, I was tied up in the smokehouse and was very severely whipped. After the major had flogged me to his satisfaction, he sent out his son Robert, a young man 18 or 20 years of age, to see that I was well smoked. He made a fire of tobacco stems, which soon set me to coughing and sneezing. This, Robert told me, was the way his father used to do his slaves in Virginia. After giving me what they conceived to be a decent smoking, I was untied and again set to work. So this was written by a former slave. So it gives you a real indication of just how cruel of treatment they had in the South. The impact of slavery upon slave families. I mentioned earlier in the film clip that families were separated, and here's another example of that. So this was basically an interview of a former slave. And the question is, are families often separated? How many such cases have you personally known? And the answer said, I never knew a whole family to live together till all were grown up in my life. There is almost always in every family some one or more keen and bright, or else sullen and stubborn slave whose influence they are afraid of won the rest of the family, and such a one must take a walking ticket to the South. There are other causes of separation. The death of a large owner is the occasion usually of many families being broken up. Bankruptcy is another cause of separation, and the hardness of a majority of slaveholders, another and a more fruitful cause than either or all of the rest. Generally, there is but little more scruple about separating families than there is with a man who keeps sheep and selling off the lambs in the fall. On one plantation where I lived, there was an old slave named Paris. He was from 50 to 60 years old and a very honest and apparently pious slave. A slave trader came along one day, and together hands for the South. The old master ordered the waiter or coachman to take Paris into the back room, pluck out all his gray hairs, rub his face with a greasy towel, then had him brought forward and sold for a young man. His wife consented to go with him upon a promise from the trader that they should be sold together with their youngest child, which she carried in her arms. They left 2 behind them, who were only from 4 to 6 or 8 years of age. The speculator collected his drove, started from the market, and before he left the stair, he sold that infant child to pay one of his tavern bills, and took the balance in cash. I'll show you another source called Children's Lives Under Slavery. I'll skip down here. It says, another evil of slavery is the want of parental care and attention. My parents were not able to give me any attention to their children during the day. I often suffered much from hunger and other similar causes. To estimate the sad state of a slave child, you must look at it as a helpless human being thrown up upon the world without the benefit of his natural guardians, is shown into the world without a social circle to flee to for hope, shelter, comfort, or instruction. The social circle, with all its heaven ordained blessings, is of the utmost importance to the tender child. But of this, the slave child, however tender and delicate, is robbed. Down here it says, another evil of slavery that I felt severely about this time was the tyranny and abuse of the overseers. These men seemed to look with an evil eye upon children. I was once visiting a menagerie and being struck with the fact that the lion was comparatively indifferent to everyone around his cage, while he eyed with peculiar keenness a little boy I had. The keeper informed me that such was always the case. Such is true of those human beings in the slave states called overseers. They seem to take pleasure in torturing the children of slaves long before they are large enough to be put at the hoe and consequently under the whip. And then finally, his experience as a slave child. My father was a slave to a near neighbor. The apartment where I was born and where I spent my childhood and youth was called the kitchen, situated some 15 or 20 rods from the great house. Here the house servants lodged and lived, and here the meals were prepared for people in the mansion. My infancy was spent upon the floor in a rough cradle or sometimes in my mother's arms. My early boyhood in playing with other boys and girls, colored and white, in the yard, and occasionally doing such little matters of labor as one of so young years could. I knew no difference between myself and the white children, nor did they seem to know any in turn. Sometimes my master would come out and give a biscuit to me and another one of his own white boys, but I did not perceive the difference between us. I had no brothers or sisters, but there were other colored families living in the same kitchen and the children playing in the same yard with me and my mother. When I began to work, I discovered the difference between myself and my master's white children. They began to order me about, and were told to do so by the master and the mistress. I found, too, that they had learned to read, while I was not permitted to have a book in my hand. To be in possession of anything written or printed was regarded as an offense, and then there was the fear that I might be sold away from those who were dear to me and conveyed to the far south. I had learned that being a slave I was subject to the worst of all calamities, and I knew of others in similar situations to myself, the sold away. My friends were not numerous, but in portion, as they were few, they were dear. The thought that I might be separated from them forever was like that of having the heart wrenched from its socket, while the idea of being conveyed to the far south seemed infinitely worse than the terrors of death. So again, you see physical and psychological abuse of slaves. Uh, Slaves were also allowed to marry on some plantations, uh, but it was not considered a legal marriage. But this was one way that plantation owners used to control slaves. In other words, in order to pacify them, because there was always this fear of slave rebellion. So there was always this fear that the slaves would rise up against the whites. But if they allowed them to have families, then that helped to pacify them. But they could also use these families as forms of punishment as well. Again, threats of sale and so forth. And amongst slave families, it's important to understand that slave families were very maternalistically driven. So, in other words, the mother was really the head of the family in slave families, unlike white families. So, it's important to keep in mind. So it was very much a different dynamic. Slaves also had religion. Now, initially, religion was taught to them on the plantations, and that continued on through the 1800s. But the religion was very selective. The religion was not meant to give them hope. It was meant for them to know their place. Slaves were in the Bible, after all. But many slaves will start to form their own religion, particularly after the Second Great Awakening, because the Second Great Awakening was very appealing to slaves because it was the idea of all are equal under the eyes of God. So slaves would have kind of secret churches of their own. They would meet at night or separate from the white churches. And it was generally either Baptist or Methodist churches. So I want to show you this film, but it's kind of long. It's about slave life, so it just kind of further exemplifies what slave life was like. What happened in the 1930s, there was this push by the federal government to really capture the understanding of lives of slaves. In other words, they wanted to maintain the historical record of what slave life was like. So in the 1930s, there was this project where former slaves were interviewed about their lives as slaves. And oftentimes these slaves were like, 80, 90, 100 years old. They were children when they were emancipated. So this is a clip from a show called Nightline back in 1999, and it talks about these former slaves, and it provides some commentary from former slaves. So I'm not going to show it here because it's kind of long. So I do want you to look at it, and the link is on campus. And all of the sources and film clips that I showed in this lecture are also located on Canvas under your module. And then finally, I want to talk about free blacks. There were a number of free blacks who lived in the Old South. By 1860, there were nearly 500,000 free blacks in the U.S., and most of them lived in the South. And most free blacks were descendants of slaves that had been freed by their owners after the American Revolution or as a result of emancipation in the northern states or abolition in the northern states. Free blacks were allowed by law to own property and marry, but could not be bought or sold. Free blacks could not testify in courts or serve on a jury, and the majority of free blacks who lived in the lower South resided in cities like New Orleans and Charleston, whereas those living in the upper South generally lived in rural areas and worked for wages as farm laborers. And if you'll remember, I mentioned in the Market Revolution that free blacks were not often given opportunities to work in the factories. So most of them remained either as domestic workers or farm workers. And it was dangerous as a free black to live in the South because there was always that threat of capture. There was sometimes even a threat of capture living in the North. But many moved to the South, one, because that's where the work was with respect to farm labor, since they were being shut out of the manufacturing world for the most part. And also, many of them still had relatives that were slaves, and they wanted to be near them. And any that owned slaves generally owned them as a result of freeing a relative. So, in order to free a relative, they would buy the slave and then free them. So, it wasn't often that you would see former slaves owning slaves. It was generally that they owned uh, relatives and then, of course, freed them. All right, so this ends your lecturing on slavery. If you have any questions, please let me know. And again, please make sure that you view any of the links and sources that I discussed in this lecture.